Space, often referred to as humanity's final frontier. This seemingly infinite expanse contains trillions of stars, solar systems, and planets. A truly unfathomable entity, waiting to be explored, waiting for its secrets to be revealed. Here at the Kerbal Space Center, we are far from space. So what can we do to change that? Hey guys, it's Messier82, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to go to space. With KSP's For Science update bringing some massive improvements to the game, I am excited to get into it a little bit today. Don't worry, I am not stopping with flyout content, but I am starting to grow to different games too. Let's start with building our first ever rocket. I am certain you have all heard about it, but KSP is a game where you get to torture these little green spacemen in their frivolous attempts to go to space. Your goal? Build a rocket, go to space, collect data. Use that data to buy more stuff. Use that stuff to get even further into space. Conduct experiments with your test subjects. And of course, knowing me, have fun building every single airplane and rocket you physically can along the way. Let's start with building our first ever rocket. We will be playing in hard mode, so our astronauts will not be able to survive. We can't just restart our session if we die. There is only one shot at success. So because of this, we've decided to use our expendable intern, Tim C. Kerman. I mean, after all, Val, Jeb, Bob, and Bill are all staples of the space program. Of course, we'll be sure to still use them in launches, but seeing as this is my first vehicle, I'm going to use our little intern here. Plus, it's not like he has to do much anyways, all he's gotta do is hit the parachute button on his way down. But you know what? For the first time in Kerbal history, we'll try to have an emphasis on safety whenever any of the main astronauts who aren't our crappy intern, screw you Tim, are in the rocket. Of course, we'll save all our experiments for the lesser interns as well. Our first goal while building this rocket is everyone's first goal in KSP, and it's the first mission for the new For Science mode. Step 1. Go up. Step 2. Go down. Step 3. Don't explode. As you can see, this is a very large list of objectives, nearly impossible to complete. So how will I pull this off? Step 1 is going up, so let's focus on that first. But how do we get this tube to go up? To figure that out, we're going to take a look at one of the most famous experiments, Tsiolkovsky's boat experiment. Imagine you're on the boat in the middle of the water with no propulsion. The only thing on the boat with you is a pile of rocks. To get to the shore with this boat, assuming you don't just paddle with your hands, the only way to propel yourself is by throwing rocks off the back. You might notice that your boat is propelled forwards by throwing the rock backwards. You may also find if you get in your shopping carriage with a fire extinguisher that shooting the propellant or the fire extinguisher sauce out the back, you'll start going forwards. So from both of these experiments, we can conclude that by throwing mass backwards, that mass in turn pushes us forwards. This is, as discussed in our previous video, I'll link it in the top right or something wherever the tooltip is Newton's third law. Newton's third law states this: every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So for example, as we push back on the rocks push forwards on us. It is also important to note that those forces are always, and I mean always, equal. So for example, the force we exert on these exhaust gases coming out of our rocket right now is the exact same forces the exhaust gases exert on us going upwards. And since we're so aggressively pushing these exhaust gases downwards, those exhaust gases in turn aggressively push us upwards. And that's what provides all of our thrust. This is just about the most basic concept of rocket propulsion and is essential to understanding how they work. Let's go back to the boat example. We can also use this example to measure thrust and specific impulse, two other very important terms in the world of rocketry. For example, if you have a 1 kilogram rock and you sort of throw it backwards slowly, you kind of just toss it into the water, versus you just like have another 1 kilogram rock and you just like whip that thing at Mach Jesus in the other direction. Which one's gonna propel you further? Obviously, the rock you threw faster is going to propel you further. So even though you traveled further with the second rock, you still only used 1 kilogram of fuel, right? Or 1 kilogram of rocks, I suppose. So couldn't we say that we would get more efficiency to throw the same mass faster? Well, congrats, that's almost exactly what specific impulse is. It's just about directly proportional to exhaust velocity, or how fast the rocket can throw that equal mass out the back. But of course, that's only part of the rocket equation. More on specific impulse in another video. Anyways, let's take that boat into account again. The next part of our rocket equation is mass flow rate and thrust. This time, the rocks you're throwing are thrown at the same speed. Rock number 1 is 1 kilogram, while rock number 2 is 2 kilograms. When throwing those two rocks off the back, which one gets you further? The answer is pretty obviously that 2 kilogram rock. But this time, since the rock is bigger and heavier, you're using more quote-unquote fuel to travel that distance. This would be referred to as the mass flow rate in rocketry. While in this example you do get double the thrust, you also get double the mass flow rate, meaning total specific impulse, or rocket efficiency, stays equal. And why did that efficiency stay equal? Well, the actual exhaust velocity, or the velocity of which you threw the rocks, remained identical. Remember how earlier I said it's directly proportional to velocity or exhaust velocity? Well, there you go. Anyways, a combination of how much you can throw out the back and how quickly you can throw it is what thrust ultimately is. Let's build ourselves a little experiment here. These two rockets, Rocket 1 and Rocket 2, have the same mass and fuel. One throws a lot of stuff out the back, and the other one throws just a little bit out the back. Both of these rockets have almost the exact same specific impulse or exhaust velocity. So since they have the same efficiency and the same amount of fuel, let's see which one's going to go further. Now what happened there? The slow one got to 7,200 while the fast one only got to 6,800. If they have the exact same impulse, they should have gone the same height, right? Well, you see, that's where our margins of error come in. Our biggest margin of error is something we ignore in every single algebraic physics equation, and that is some mystical substance known as air resistance. Air resistance, or drag, is what happens when you travel through the air. Remember Newton's third law from earlier? Well, as you push on the air and displace the air around your rocket, that air in turn pushes back on you. Just as our little parachute here pushes down on the air in turn pushes up on our parachute, therefore slowing us down. From looking at the drag equation, we can determine that increasing your velocity, assuming all other conditions remain the same, will exponentially increase the amount of drag and air resistance that affects your vehicle. So since the faster rocket was, well, going faster, it had a significantly higher amount of drag acting on the vehicle and therefore couldn't go as far. The bigger motor propelled the rocket to a far higher speed, and because of this, there was a lot more drag from the air around it. That thick, soupy, low atmosphere is ultra thick in the first place, and going that fast through it will surely slow you down. So generally speaking, rockets launched from Earth are sort of designed to be aerodynamic just so that way they can cut through the atmosphere easier. This is why rockets will have fairings and nose cones and all those fancy little things that make it pointy. Using what we've learned about specific impulse, thrust, mass flow rate, and air resistance, it was time to construct our first ever rocket. Well, our first ever real rocket that isn't experiments. In KSP2 science mode, the goal is pretty simple. Launch a rocket, collect scientific data, research parts, go further, collect more data, and research more parts. This goes on until we reach the end of the tech tree where we get all sorts of fancy doodads such as nuclear thermal rocket motors, hydrogen tanks, and who knows what will be there by the time we reach it. But all great things must start small, so here is our first ever KSP2 build. This little guy is known as the LTV-1 Flea, and it was designed for one purpose. Go up, go down, and not explode. Well, that's three things actually. We'd be using a Methalox fuel tank on this rocket. Methalox rockets is essentially a cryogenic liquid tank of both methane and oxygen, which are separate from each other. These two are kept separate until they are mixed in the combustion chamber. This method of propulsion is known as liquid fuel. And of course, this is the original default motor that you get at the very start of the tech tree. It's a relatively simple nozzle vectoring, meaning the nozzle spins to change their direction, liquid fuel motor. After it burns what little fuel it has, the stages separate, our motor falls back on the Kerbal Space Center, killing potentially hundreds, and we safely parachute down to the surface where Tim, disembarks, hopefully in one piece, to fly another mission. And with that, we are ready to fly out. Wait, no, that's the wrong game. We're ready to Kerbal space. Every Kerbal has its space program. You know what, let's just launch. And with that, our little goofball here is off the ground. Little Goofball Mark 1 is designed to just go up and down. I don't have to leave the atmosphere or do anything fancy. We're good with that. The launch was pretty successful. We reached speeds of about Mach 2.5, if I remember correctly. We ditched the rocket stage and then we came straight back down and landed right where we took off again. Well, that went well. We went up, we ditched our rocket motor, we fell back down, and we deployed our parachute. But honestly, that wasn't all that impressive, was it? Many people have done that in the past. That was just our first mission, so let's hope for some even more impressive builds in the future. And for next time, let's try not to hit the KSP with our rocket parts. Goal number 2. Go to space and survive, optionally. And what exactly counts as space? Well, that's something that's internationally disputed. The atmosphere doesn't just end and disappear, it continues up and up for a very long time. Even in deep space, you'll still find random particles floating around. This is why all of our low Earth orbital vehicles are in what is called a decaying orbit, where they are slowly losing energy due to running into these air particles. Does that mean that the atmosphere extends into orbit or even deep space? Well, I guess, but not really. Generally speaking, it's internationally agreed upon that the atmosphere ends when it becomes too negligible to care about. Like, yeah, those orbits may be decaying, but it's only noticeable in like 100 years when we don't care about the satellites anyways. Generally speaking, space begins at about 100 kilometers. This is referred to as the Kármán line. Also, it's important to note that anyone who flies above 50 miles, or about 80 kilometers, is given the honorary title of astronaut by the FAA. That is, of course, assuming the person in the vehicle is a member of the flight crew or assists with the safety of the spaceflight in some way. So, for example, if some billionaire pays to be a passenger on a space mission, he is classified as a passenger, not an astronaut. On the other hand, a lot of orbital vehicles like to hang over 125 kilometers to prevent a significant decaying orbit, with some arguing space should be classified at that altitude instead. So 100, 80, 125? Who knows, man. Luckily for us, KSP doesn't really care about that. Kerbin is a planet that is about 10.5 times smaller than Earth. This is to make the space flights happen in a quicker, more cartoony, and less boring way. Kerbin's atmosphere also ends at exactly 70 kilometers. Anything above this, even at 71 kilometers, doesn't decay whatsoever. Once you pass that threshold and go, let's say, 69 kilometers, you will decay and burn up in the atmosphere in less than 1 revolution. Amazing what a difference 1 kilometer can make. So, let's look at our goals again. We can say instead of going to space, just go above 70 kilometers. Here's the vehicle we're going to be doing it with. The LTV-1-B Ant is a modification of our past vehicle. What does it do differently, you might ask? That's a great question, really is. It's longer, has more fuel, but otherwise it's literally the same rocket. That's it. So, you know, with our advanced and radically different vehicle to the last one, I think we are just about ready to launch. And here is our next launch. One of the first things you'll notice is that we in fact accelerate slower than our original rocket. This is because despite having the same amount of thrust and therefore the same amount of force, there's a lot more weight or mass on the vehicle. We all remember Newton's second law, F equals ma. We can rearrange that equation and say that acceleration is equal to force over mass. So therefore, with the same force in a heavier rocket, you're going to accelerate a little bit slower. You'll also notice right off the bat that I started turning over the ocean, towards the east I believe. Due to the rotation of Kerbin being to the east, if I plan on doing any orbital insertions in the future, that is the most efficient direction to turn. On top of that, the ocean was right over there, so I figured it was the easiest place to turn. We end our ascent profile and reach our apogee, or I suppose we can just call it an apoapsis, reaching to about 213 kilometers. This is well beyond space in just about every classification, so I was pretty happy with that. On the way down, we actually experienced some pretty extreme heating as we were going very, very fast. Faster than I expected, as we had a little bit more power than I expected. So we'll definitely have to spec into some thermal shielding for next flight. But otherwise, it was pretty uneventful. I came back down, I ditched my rocket stage, and I parachuted and splashed down safely in the ocean. Tim C was safe another day. It's been like 2 successful flights now. I'm starting to feel like his days are numbered. Well, let's stuff him into the next rocket and hope he doesn't die. Goal number 3. Get into orbit, revolve around the planet once, and come back down, optionally alive. At this point, I should probably point out that with all the research we got from our previous missions, we could actually buy some stuff. We bought a few fancy goobabs and doodads such as science equipment, thermal shielding, better antennae, better boosters, solid fuel boosters this time around, and a few other things such as radial decouplers. This would all not only help us get into space, but help us collect even more scientific data. This vehicle will have to be far more complex than our previous 2 vehicles, and this is where we will dive into vehicle staging. In the real world, the first 2-stage rocket was launched in 1948 in an attempt to achieve higher altitudes than ever before for atmospheric sampling and testing at ultra-high altitudes. This was achieved by taking the German V2 rocket, launching it straight up, and attaching a smaller rocket to the top which ejected and burned straight up after the V2 ran out of fuel. The question is, why would we do this? Why wouldn't we take the fuel from that smaller rocket and put it into the V2? Well, there are a few answers to this question, but the most prominent reason is weight, or I guess you could say mass, overall. Think about a drop tank on a fighter plane, for example. The fuel from those tanks drain first, but once it's out of fuel, why keep it around? It's just a bunch of extra weight and extra drag. So because of this, the aircraft ditches the tank and keeps flying on its internal fuel. The rocket uses the same principle as this, but even more extreme. While the fuel runs out and the weight of the rocket decreases, the engine and fuel tanks still exist and still weigh several tons. In a rocket launch where every bit of weight matters, ditching this extra motor and extra fuel tank is crucial to making it into orbit. Plus, having these stages allows us to design rockets efficiently for the altitude they're designed to operate at, but we'll get more into that on another video. So here it is, the OV-1 Speedster, or Orbital Vehicle 1. The OV-1 starts with a solid fuel stage and quickly burns us into the upper atmosphere. As opposed to the liquid fuel burners we've been using so far, the solid fuel boosters use solid fuel. I know, crazy, right? Basically, instead of mixing the fuels in the combustion chamber, the propellant is already pre-mixed and is simply ignited at the bottom where it then burns out the rest of its fuel. These solid fuel boosters aren't quite as efficient as a regular booster, and they also have the drawback of no throttle control and no ability to turn it off once they're started, but they do provide a lot of thrust at a pretty cheap price. That makes them an ideal low-altitude lifting motor. They sort of exist as some sort of speed boost. They get you off the ground and they get you high altitude and high speed, but that's about all they do. From there on out, the sustainer stages, or those liquid fuel stages, will do the rest of the work. Once these radially mounted solid fuel motors separate, a central liquid fuel launch motor will continue to burn until the rocket leaves the atmosphere. From there, the bottom stage will separate, revealing science equipment for recording some info in orbit, as well as a sustainer motor, or a rocket motor specifically designed with lower thrust but a lot of efficiency in a vacuum. Using this stage, we hope to achieve our first orbit. To achieve an orbit though, we kinda have to know what an orbit is. Things don't just start floating when they get to space after all. This seems to be a pretty common misconception a lot of people seem to have. Gravity doesn't just end. You could literally have two golf balls a million miles apart from each other and they'll still exert gravitational force on each other, albeit a very small one. Just going away from a planet isn't enough to stay in space. Instead, you need to achieve an orbit. Since gravity is always pulling you down, an orbit is essentially just going sideways fast enough so when gravity does eventually pull you down, you'll be going so fast sideways that you'll simply miss the planet entirely. Basically, yeah, you're falling down to the planet, but you're going sideways so fast that you're also perpetually missing the planet. So you throw yourself at the planet and miss. That's how you orbit it. And that's a pretty particular balance. Too slow and you're not going to be able to get out of the way of the planet in time and you're just going to burn up in the atmosphere and crash and die and it's going to be horrid. Too fast and your orbit will be all gigantic and elliptical and you'll go flying out into space before coming back down. It'll be also pretty dumb unless your goal is a transfer or a really weird satellite orbit. If you want a perfectly circular orbit, you need to hit exactly the right speed, which can be rather difficult. After that, however, it's pretty simple. Once I get into orbit, I simply need to revolve around the planet once, and then slow myself down back to a crashing velocity, and splash down in the ocean somewhere near the Kerbal Space Center. Now keep in mind, we'd be re-entering at an insanely fast speed. Last video you thought Mach 5 was fast, well this is even faster. Our orbital velocity, all things considered, should probably be right around 2,200 meters per second. On re-entry, we can expect probably right around the same speeds. That means in the upper layers of atmosphere where we will start feeling that friction, that's speeds of about Mach 7. Luckily, once again, since Kerbin is smaller than Earth, we don't have to deal with the insane re-entry speeds of approximately Mach 23 that would be associated with a low Earth orbit. That being said, the amount of friction our capsule will be dealing with is still absolutely insane. And you can't enter the atmosphere too steep either. If you enter it too steep, it's going to be way harsher on the aircraft. You're going to get a lot more drag, a lot more thermal heating, a lot more G-forces exerted on both the airframe and the pilot. It's just not going to be a good time, so you got to make sure that your entry angle is nice and shallow so that way nobody explodes. To get around all this heat though, we added an ablator to the bottom of our capsule. Essentially, an ablator is a type of thermal heat shield specifically designed for dealing with re-entry heating. It works by burning itself off in a controlled manner and taking the thermal energy in the quote-unquote burnt segments. This sort of works like a physically reactive heat sink, like sweat, you know? It's taking the heat from what would be the inside and instead putting it in these small little particles and launching it off the side. But they're really nice because they keep our spacecraft nice and cool for approach. Unfortunately, with ablators being reactive, they don't last forever. But this little heat shield we've got here should be just fine for atmospheric re-entry into Kerbin. After all that, our parachute activates and the rocket returns to the planet as normal. And that concludes our third and final flight of the day. Next time we'll be aiming even higher. Next mission we'll get to the moon. Well, at least if this video does well enough. So tell your friends, if you want to see another KSP video, let me know. See you guys then. Something a little bit different about this launch is that it's conducted at nighttime, whereas my previous two were daytime launches. There's no real reason for this, there's no orbital synchronization we need to do. Simply, I'm launching at nighttime because enough time has progressed between the last two launches where it's turned to night. You'll also notice that I'm throttling down the liquid fuel engine to start and trying to carry myself a little bit higher with the solid fuel boosters before switching to liquid fuel. This is because, as we discussed earlier, drag is a thing that exists. And this thing would be generating a lot more drag if I was just going full throttle with all the engines, so we decided to chill out a little bit. As you guys saw only moments ago, we have just separated our solid fuel stage and we're onto our liquid fuel sustainer. This part isn't meant to get us into orbit. It has a generally good performance in atmosphere and out of atmosphere, and is simply designed to get us to orbital altitude. From there on out, the orbital sustainer stage, you know, the one that works really well in a vacuum but doesn't generate all too much thrust. Yeah, that one's going to carry us into orbit here. From there, we'll transmit all of our scientific data, we will ditch our science pod, and it'll just be us and the thermal shield re-entering the atmosphere. Luckily enough, in KSP, reaction wheels are a thing that exists and somehow fit into this tiny little capsule that I have. So therefore, I don't really need any RCS or any propulsion for stability because they just balance us out. We'll explain how they work in another video. But anyways, by now we have revolved around the planet once and we are getting ready to re-enter the atmosphere. We'll get a good amount of scientific information from this, as well as all the science from completing the mission, meaning we'll be able to build even better rockets next episode. Well, we'll see how this video does. If you guys enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like and talk about it in the comment section so I know if I can make another one or not. Otherwise, as we deploy our parachute and get ready to splash down here, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. See you all in the next one, and goodbye.